So climate change is one that we've incorporated, and another which we've started to incorporate. And this year, for the first time, when we announced it, as I pointed out, it's the first time that it actually, in our minds, had an impact on the actual value of the clock, is another emerging technology, which is artificial intelligence, and particularly the cyber world. Because, of course, that also presents a potential existential threat, as some people are, like some people publicly say they think it's the biggest one. I'm not necessarily in that mode, but there's no doubt that the development of intelligent machines will change the way we live, and in my mind, it could go in many different directions, good as well as bad. But what we pointed out is that it affected our decision in this case because of the way in which cyber warfare and hacking was potentially undermining confidence in democracy, and that, to the extent that democracy is a central part of what we view as a key part of modern civilization, at least in the West, was therefore important. And we viewed the fact that there was a loss of confidence in the democratic process during this election as one of the factors that concerned us. The other factors were specifically, and let me step back and say, you pointed out, as I think I did when we introduced it, that this is the closest to midnight it's been in 65 years or something. Well, that's a true statement. But to be fair, I think it's more important to realize that the absolute value of the clock at any time is less important than the derivative, the direction it's going. Because the direction it's going is the message we're trying to tell people. And what we said is that the direction is going closer to midnight. We only moved it 30 seconds because we said one of the reasons that we're moving it is that the President of the United States is making statements about nuclear weapons that are outrageous and terrifying. The incumbent president, at that time he wasn't yet president, but an individual who was about to be president of the United States was making statements which were extremely dangerous. At the same time, he's not the only person. Putin was making saber-rattling statements that were also dangerous. There were other factors like North Korea as well. And one of the reasons we moved it only 30 seconds was we try not to respond to individual events, and we try to look at the global picture. And one of the things we said is, look, this person is not yet in office. There are statements that have been made and about both nuclear weapons, and the other thing was climate change. We said the governing party in what is potentially arguably the strongest, or whatever, how you want to say it, country in the world, the governing party denies science.
Yeah.
And so that was a great concern. But those were words. And we said actions speak louder than words. But words matter, especially when they come from a person who's about to be president. And we said we are concerned by those words because they could be harbingers of actions. And what we really said, and this comes back to almost takes us full circle, which is that what we think we really want to tell the public is that they are if they're concerned about their future, they have to take their future into their own hands. That, namely, that governments, and not just our government, other governments are not going to deal with nuclear weapons or climate change if people don't protest, if people don't raise their voices and demonstrate their concern. Because even in our democracy, which right now looks pretty fragile, it is still true that people, even if they may not care about what's good or bad for the country, they still care about being reelected. And if the public, and there have been times in our history when having to do with nuclear weapons and also racism and Vietnam and other, if the public demonstrates that that they won't tolerate it anymore, then it'll have an effect. And so the net thing we were saying is the world is getting more dangerous in part because the leaders of the world are not caretaking as they should, and they're being negligent. And we want the public needs to first understand the problems, which is, so it's education once again, and then needs to demonstrate that they're not complacent.
This complacency issue is an additional scary fact about our situation, because I think you said at the beginning here on this topic that people have more or less forgotten about the threat of nuclear war. And the Cold War has been behind us for the longest time until suddenly now.
And it seems like there's no threat. You and I used to grow up at a time, you're younger than me, but not that much younger, at a time where at least I remember there were 50,000 nuclear weapons, and Yeah, and even more ridiculously, people would do these things in school where they'd hide under their desks, to protect
Yeah,
them from nuclear war and all that. Sorry, but anyway, go on.
yeah, those were strong desks.
Yeah,
So as you say, these nuclear weapons still exist. Not 50,000, but how many? What's the current number? Do you know?
that's what people don't realize. That's why we want to educate them. Just between the two superpowers, there's probably 5,000 nuclear weapons, maybe close to 10,000 nuclear weapons. We have 5,000 nuclear weapons.
Hmm.
The Soviets probably have 5,000. On active status, there's between 1,000 and 1,500 on each side of our sides, and which may not sound dangerous, but of course, a small fraction of that would destroy.
Yeah, it's
And
completely
moreover,
redundant. Yes.
what people don't realize, it's worse than redundant. The policies make no sense. There's no strategic utility for them because
Right.
we're not in a world of mutually assured destruction necessarily anymore. And the real threats are not of nuclear threats are probably not mutually assured destruction. They're terror. Anyway, we can go into those. But the thing is, what people don't realize is that of those 1,000, a significant fraction of our weapons are on alert status, essentially launch on warning,
Yeah.
which made sense maybe in a world where we were expecting incoming 20,000 nuclear weapons, and there wasn't time for anyone to act before the world was obliterated or our country is obliterated. But in the modern world, there's no rational need. All it does is encourage the possibility of a catastrophic error. And Eric Schlosser and others have written great books
Yeah.
delineating how close we've come so many times. It's
Yeah.
amazing if you
Well,
think about
let's
it.
recommend that book explicitly here. So Eric Schlosser, the journalist, wrote a book called Command and Control, which is absolutely harrowing. And there's a documentary that recently came out on PBS by the same name, which it focuses on a specific accident at a silo in, I think it's Arkansas, which just shows you just how haywire things can go based on the humble dropping of a very large socket wrench, right? Like
Yeah,
the guy's
yeah,
performing a maintenance, and this 20-pound wrench falls into the silo and ricochets off the side of it in such a way as to perfectly puncture the fuel tank. And then you hear a lot about the ensuing chaos. But the shocking thing is that the fact that we have not annihilated ourselves, or at least killed tens of millions in a single day, is due to an extraordinary amount of dumb luck. And when you hear the details, including things like we have dropped 20 megaton bombs on ourselves and two
yeah,
of three safeties have failed, and the final safety that didn't fail had all of the solidity of like a mechanical toggle switch, right? That had it been in
yeah.
a different position, North Carolina would have been, much of it would have been obliterated. It's just unbelievable that this is the situation we're in. And the technology that is stewarding our current missiles, I mean, we're talking about floppy disk drives and, I mean, just the most antiquated systems you can imagine. And we're still on high alert. I mean, who knows what the Russians are up to, right? I mean, if it's this
Exactly.
bad on our side, imagine what it is in Russia.
Exactly, and in fact, there's one of the more harrowing examples for me is an example from Russia of someone we actually wanted to nominate for the Nobel Peace Prize because, unlike many people who win the Nobel Peace Prize, he actually saved millions of lives. He was working he was in a missile silo, a Russian missile silo, and there was a false positive. There was a signal coming that it looked like a missile was launched from the United States, and then a minute later, another missile was launched, and then a minute later, another missile launched, and he got the order to launch his missiles.
Hmm.
And he disobeyed that order.
Yeah.
And then within minutes, of course, they discovered there was a computer glitch. But had he not done that, the world would be in a very different place. And it's amazing. It's that kind of thing. I mean, that kind of, and happily, you might think he was killed for that, but he wasn't. In the end, he was pensioned off. But that kind of act, we can't rely on that kind of accidental good judgment to save the world.
But just to step back for a second, we have put ourselves in this situation where, based on the crassest political processes, we are now perpetually under this sword of Damocles of our own devising.
Yeah.
That's so mistake prone. And now, as you say, with the dominance of cyber reality in our lives,
Yeah.
and the capacity for misinformation to spread, and for our early warning systems to be hacked, the prospect of misinformation triggering this system of self-annihilation that we have built and maintain, and barely maintain, it's insane that no one's thinking about this, or I mean, no one in the public is thinking about this.
Well, people. Well, that's exactly, that's the public. There are people thinking about it, and I will say again, to promote, not really promote, but my Origins project, which I'm very proud of, and you've been at some of our events. We did an event on AI recently, but we actually are planning, in collaboration with the Bulletin and a foundation, to look at exactly the relationship between cyber and nuclear issues. We'll probably run an event, both a public event and a rather high level study group on just that, because I think it's what's surprising is that we don't those two communities don't speak together as much as you think. But there is a real concern, right, with cyber hacking. What can you do to make this happen? And you're right that the public needs to be concerned. But let me point out, one of the arguments that's made is, well, we need to do a $1 trillion upgrade of our nuclear weapons systems in order to make them, better. Well, at first more accurate, and maybe update the technology. But what's amazing is that it begs the question of, wouldn't it be much simpler, since the system is just a recipe for disaster, to get rid of the largest part of it, saving a huge amount of money, reducing the risks overall of having a catastrophe, and leading to a saner world. So rather than spend $1 trillion and have a system that inevitably increases the risks of use, why not simply get rid of most of it? And ultimately, it would be great to have a world where we get rid of all of it, and there are people who've advocated that. But we don't need even 1,000 weapons. We don't even need 100 weapons, especially if apparently our major concerns are countries that have very few weapons. And in fact, we have concerns about countries that have no weapons. I mean, this whole concern about Iran, which was, happily, it doesn't have weapons because we acted rationally, which was diplomatically and not militarily. And so we are actually violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we're apparently signatories of. Okay, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by most countries except for the obvious ones, India and Israel and Pakistan and North Korea. I guess they may have signed it once, but anyway, certainly Israel, India, Pakistan, those, and we sort of view them as outliers because they didn't sign it. We are violating it because one of the things it said is we're trying to stop proliferation so that new countries do not gain access to nuclear weapons. But one of the requirements was that the nuclear countries work as actively as possible to disarm. And that we are not doing that in any way, shape, or form. Moreover, we're sending a signal to other countries. People react by the signals we send. It's the kind of thing that you're an expert on. And we're sending signals to countries that we value nuclear weapons, that having nuclear weapons makes a difference. And if we have send those signals, it's irrational for those countries not to want to possess them.
Well, but just look at the fact that we can't do anything about North Korea or Pakistan because they have nukes. I mean, it's proof positive that having nukes changes your status.
Yeah, and we're right now we're talking about bombing Syria. I just got a note today moments ago that's being considered, but also of course Iran, and so what messages are we sending? We're sending them messages not just that that it means something to have nukes, but you know what? We think it means something for us to have nukes. So we're going to build better nukes and new nukes and the only reason that can be is if we want to use them, right?
But again, it's not just a message. In fact, the destructive capacity of these bombs is so astonishing. And if you haven't looked at video of nuclear blasts in the last decade, go on YouTube and just look at some of the biggest explosions ever filmed. It is, and obviously I'm not saying this to you, Lawrence, I'm talking to our listeners. I recently did this, and I was startled to realize as I was looking at this footage that I hadn't looked at it in years and years, right? And it's just as a meditation exercise. Just try to get an intuitive sense of what you're seeing here and map it onto the city where you live. It's breathtaking on every level, morally, aesthetically. I mean, it's strangely beautiful too, which is also weird.
Yeah. Nature is both terrifying and beautiful in many ways, and it's a natural. I mean, whether you like it or not, the nuclear weapons represent a natural phenomena that is remarkable, and it's the phenomena that makes our life possible inside the sun, but it's also terrifying.
And the idea that this could be triggered by accident or error is one thing that we should find absolutely intolerable. And then there's this added layer, which we now confront in a way that I wasn't expecting we would ever confront it again, which is you could have people in charge of your government or other nuclear powers who are so carefree in their attitude toward the risks here, and even so open-minded about the prospect of using these weapons, which we have in the case of Trump, that it's an enormous problem to think about how we walk back from the precipice here. Because again, you can't ignore is that in our current world, it matters whether you're a nuclear power.
Yeah. It does, but you know what matters is we treat nuclear policy in a different way. I wrote a piece on this in the New Yorker once, and because of Trump, there's a discussion, but I don't think it's going to happen. But many people also don't realize, and this is terrifying to people, doesn't matter who's president, there are no checks on the president. The president can order nuclear weapons to be used, and there's no procedure for anyone, for Congress, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or anyone to circumvent that order, except maybe someone on the ground.
And many of us just found out about that with the inauguration of Trump, right? I mean, it's like
exactly.
We thought that there was some sensible process by which you could constrain the impulse of some president who's grown demented or had a stroke or just is drunk. I mean, I think there actually is a story about Nixon when he was drinking a lot during Watergate that some admiral said, listen, if the president says anything to you about the codes, you're going to call me before you do anything.
Yeah, you have to openly disobey. And look, I mean, again, it wasn't crazy. There was a claimed reason for this, which was, again, mutually assured destruction. When there were 50,000 nuclear weapons, then you got 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and so, but we don't live in that world anymore, where that's, or maybe we still do in some sense, but the public should be aware of it and decide which risk they'd rather face. To me, that's the whole point of science, as a basis for public policy, is that scientists shouldn't make public policy, but the empirical evidence and the results of science should form the basis of public policy. So the public should be informed. They could the country could decide to do nothing about climate change, but we shouldn't lie about it. We should say, okay, this is the world we're going to create, but we, for one reason or another, we want to make money, or we want to do this or that. That's okay. If the public, that's part of democracy. But the public needs to know these things about nuclear weapons, and that's one of the reasons things like the Doomsday Clock, which hopefully can alert the public about that, and about the silliness, about the fact that talking about strategic nuclear policy is almost an oxymoron, because there's no place where nuclear weapons, using them, makes sense. And moreover, other things that have been ridiculous that I've written about for a long time, that missile defense, we spent over $1 trillion over the last 30 or 40 years on missile defense. It doesn't exist.
Actually, I want to ask you about that. So there have been successful uses of it in Israel against the Iraqi Scuds.
Well, but even those, if you read some of the real data, suggests that the claimed successes are far exceed the actual successes.
So do you not put much hope in the prospects of building viable missile defense 10, 20, 30 years?
No, okay. There's good reasons for it. First of all, unlike a Scud, for example, a nuclear weapon is different. So there's really basic physics arguments. In general, when it comes to all weapon systems, offense is cheaper than defense.
Yeah.
So let's say we did build a missile defense system that was 50% efficient, which we don't have. Okay, but let's say we did. I'm talking about nuclear ballistic missile defense. Okay, then you have what that means is that for every 2 missiles you send, 1 will be intercepted. But once you've figured out how to build nuclear weapons, it's a lot cheaper to build 2 nuclear weapons instead of 1.
Yeah. Also, you can build warheads that fragment into 20 separate.
Well, that's the next stage. No, our missile defense system has never been tested against a realistic threat. It's failed miserably in many cases against unrealistic threats. So, namely, sometimes it succeeds when the missile defense system is told where the missile is coming from and when it was launched, then boy, it can intercept it. But it's never been tested against realistic threats. And I used to say, when George Bush was talking about in 2004. He said, we're going to build a missile defense system. We're going to deploy it next year that, will be 90% efficient or something. And it turned out that 50% of the American public thought we already had a missile defense. And what I said at the time was we should have kept it that way. We just say we have it. It's a lot cheaper. It's just as efficient. It's just as effective as a non-working and less threatening because it's less proliferating. And so people have looked, and physicists have done many studies of different ways of defending against early stage missiles, and so that ultimately there's no way to have anything that Ronald Reagan thought of as this Star Wars barrier against nuclear missiles, because you can always build defensive systems that are cheaper and can avoid defenses. Yes, you can make the enemy spend more money in certain sense, but it's largely and strategically a waste of money, and it is inherently destabilizing because what it does is encourage countries to simply create more nuclear weapons. Because even if we had a 90% efficient system,
the 10% is a disaster. Yeah.
Well, not just but you can ask how likely it is. Is it how many weapons do you have to go send before you're guaranteed to get to have a successful strike? And it's something like 4 or 5. So you build instead of having 10 weapons, you have 50 weapons.
Right.
And you have the same aggressive possible impact on this country. And so if you think about the logic of that, it sounds nice. It appeals like many things. It sounds nice to what we all want to believe. And again, I get back to that's what science is all about. We want to believe that these things are possible. We see them in Star Wars movies, and it would be nice to believe them, but we have to be skeptical of ourselves.